There is a report in the British Library, catalogued among the publications of the Board of Agriculture, that most researchers pass over without a second glance. It was written in 1801 by Arthur Young, the secretary of the board, and the single most influential voice in English agriculture. For 30 years, Young had toured the country arguing that enclosure of the commons was the engine of progress. Then he changed his mind. He conducted a survey of enclosed parishes and found what he had spent his career denying. That enclosure had ruined them. He wrote it up. He presented it to the board's own committee, and the committee told him, in terms that were polite and unmistakable, that his findings would not be published under their name. Young could do what he pleased with it privately, they said. It would make no difference. The report exists. You can read it, but it was never supposed to reach you. I found it because I was looking for something else entirely. I was trying to trace the legal mechanics of how common land was enclosed, parish by parish, working through the Board of Agriculture's own publications in the hope of reconstructing a procedural timeline. What I found instead was the moment the system's own architect admitted it was destroying the people it claimed to serve. Young's survey concluded that 19 out of 20 enclosure acts had injured the poor. That figure did not come from a radical pamphleteer or a Chartist agitator. It came from the man the government had appointed to promote enclosure. And when his evidence contradicted the program won. To understand what Young was describing and why his evidence was so dangerous, I need to walk through the machinery he was defending for 3 decades before he turned against it. Parliamentary enclosure was not a single event. It was a legislative program that ran in its most concentrated form from roughly 1750 to 1830, though acts were passed as early as 1604 and as late as 1914. In that central period, Parliament passed more than 4,000 individual enclosure acts. The total across the full span exceeds 5,200. Between them, they transferred approximately 6.8 million acres of common land, open fields, and waste into private ownership. That is more than 1/5 of England's total land area, moved from collective use to individual title within a few generations. The process worked the same way in almost every parish. A petition would be drawn up, typically by the largest landholders in the district, requesting that Parliament authorise the enclosure of common land. The petition required the support of owners holding 3/4 of the land by value, not by number, which meant that 2 or 3 large proprietors could outvote every smallholder and cottager in the parish combined. Once the petition reached Parliament, a notice was posted on the church door of the affected parish, written in English in legal language, announcing the proposed enclosure and inviting objections. I want to be precise about what that notice meant in practice. The majority of cottagers and agricultural labourers in the late 18th century could not read. The notice was posted in a language they did not command, advertising a legal process they could not afford to challenge. Objections had to be made through lawyers at the objector's expense before commissioners who were invariably drawn from the same landowning class as the petitioners. I have looked at dozens of enclosure awards from Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, and Cambridgeshire. The commissioners were surveyors and gentlemen farmers. The objectors, where they appear at all, were represented by nobody. Once the commissioners completed their survey, land was allocated. Every recipient, including the smallest, was required to pay a proportional share of the costs of enclosure, which included surveying, fencing, legal fees, and the commissioner's own charges. For a large landowner, these costs were trivial relative to the value of the consolidated holding. For a cottager who had been allocated a strip of 2 or 3 acres, the costs frequently exceeded the value of the land itself. The result was predictable and well documented. Smallholders sold their allotments immediately, often to the very landowners who had petitioned for enclosure in the first place. The process that was meant to allocate land fairly became the mechanism by which land was concentrated. The legal process taken at face value looks orderly. Petitions were filed, to notices were posted, commissioners surveyed, awards were drawn up. But consider who controlled each stage, and the order begins to look different. Here is where the history becomes difficult to explain as mere administrative oversight. The Board of Agriculture, established in 1793 under Sir John Sinclair, published more than 90 volumes promoting enclosure as agricultural improvement. It was, in effect, a government body dedicated to accelerating the transfer of common land into private hands. When Arthur Young, its own secretary, produced evidence that this programme was devastating the rural poor, the board's committee reviewed his findings and declined to publish them. The report was not refuted. It was not challenged on its evidence. It was simply set aside. If the process was fair, why was the only dissenting evidence produced from inside the institution itself buried by that institution? The pattern holds parish by parish, county by county, and it holds most vividly in a single place. Otmoor is a low, flat stretch of land in Oxfordshire, roughly 4,000 acres of common ground that had been used by 7 surrounding villages for as long as anyone could trace. The parishes of Charlton on Otmoor, Fencott, Murcott, Noke, Beckley, Horton-cum-Studley, and Oddington all held rights over the moor. Cattle grazed there. Fuel was gathered. Geese were kept on the common in numbers that supplemented the income of families who would otherwise have had nothing beyond their wages. In 1805, an Enclosure Act was passed for Otmoor. I have read the award. The largest allocations went to the lord of the manor and to the rector of Oddington, who received land in exchange for supporting the petition. The cottagers of the 7 villages, whose common rights had sustained them for centuries, received little or nothing. The costs of fencing and drainage fell on everyone, and those who could not pay lost what they had been given. I am trying to describe this carefully, because the human detail matters and most of it does not survive in the parliamentary record. What the common provided was not merely grazing land. It was a system of rights that had no equivalent in the enclosed landscape. Pasture meant a family could keep a cow. Turbary meant they could cut peat or turf for fuel. Estovers meant they could gather wood. Pannage meant their pigs could forage in the autumn. Gleaning meant that after the harvest, the poorest families could gather what remained in the fields. These were not luxuries. They were the margin between subsistence and destitution. I have not found her name in any Enclosure award. I have found the gap where her name should be. She is a composite assembled from the kind of evidence that survives when individual lives do not. Parish poor relief records in the Oxfordshire County Archives, Flora Thompson's accounts of post-enclosure village life in neighbouring Juniper Hill, and the common rights documented across dozens of parishes. She is a cottager's wife living near Otmoor around 1812. She kept a single cow on the common. She gathered fuel under estovers. She gleaned after harvest. She could not read. The notice was pinned to the church door of her parish. It announced in legal English that the common on which her cow grazed was to be enclosed, surveyed, and allocated. She walked past it, as she walked past everything pinned to that door, because the written word was not her world. The commissioners came. The fences went up. The cow was gone, because the land on which it had grazed was now behind a fence that belonged to someone else, and the strip she was allocated, if she was allocated anything at all, could not sustain an animal once the fencing costs were deducted. Arthur Young recorded a line that I keep returning to. It appears in his survey of enclosed parishes, the same report the board declined to publish. A woman told him, or someone like him, in words he transcribed with the flatness of a man who had heard it too many times, "I had a cow, and an Act of Parliament has taken it from me." Young did not editorialise. He did not need to. The Hammonds, writing more than a century later in their study of the village labourer, reached a conclusion that has never been successfully challenged. The cottager was a labourer with land, and after enclosure, he was a labourer without land. How many of the 4,000 acts passed in that century contained a woman like her, unnamed and uncompensated, whose loss appears in no parliamentary record? The parish poor relief records tell part of the story. In Northamptonshire, Cambridgeshire and Oxfordshire, counties that lost more than half their land to enclosure, applications for poor relief rose sharply in the years immediately following enclosure awards. The pattern is consistent enough that E.P. Thompson, in his study of the English working class, treated it as structural rather than coincidental. Jeanette Neeson's work on the Northamptonshire Commons documented the same trajectory in granular detail. Families that had been self-sustaining before enclosure became dependent on parish charity within a generation, sometimes within a decade. The resistance, when it came, was not theoretical. In 1830, 25 years after the Otmoor Enclosure Act, roughly 1,000 people from the 7 villages walked the ancient boundary of the moor, tearing down the fences that had been erected across it. They did this in daylight. They did this together. When arrests were made and prisoners taken to Oxford, a crowd at St Giles's Fair broke them free. Dragoons were quartered at Oddington Rectory, in the house of the very rector who had received land from the enclosure. The fences were rebuilt, the resistance was suppressed, the moor remained enclosed. Go back to Otmoor, go back to the common before the fences. Go back to one woman who does not appear in any award. It is the morning after the commissioners have finished their work. The common is fenced. The cow is gone, sold, or simply removed because the land it grazed on is no longer hers to use. She walks to the church where the notice was posted, a piece of paper she could never read, authorising the removal of everything that kept her family from the parish relief rolls. The churchyard is quiet. The geese that once wandered the common are gone. The children who gathered fuel under estovas will not do so again. The gleaning fields are behind fences now, and gleaning is no longer a right but a trespass. I am not sentimentalising this. I am describing what the archive does not contain, and its absence is the point. She appears in no enclosure award. She gave no testimony to any commission. She left no letter, no diary, no record of protest. What she left, if she left anything, is a line in a parish poor relief ledger, an application dated to the years after enclosure. One entry among the sharp rise that the Oxfordshire records show across parish after parish in the decade following the enclosure of Otmoor. The question I cannot answer is not whether she existed. It is how many of her there were. The commons were taken through the machinery of law by a parliament in which the dispossessed had no vote, no voice, and no representation. The evidence of the damage was produced by the government's own appointed expert, and it was suppressed by the institution that appointed him. The pattern did not end with the Enclosure Acts. It settled into the landscape. Today, approximately 25,000 people own half of England. The average house costs nearly 8 times the average income. The rent is still being collected on land that was, within traceable memory, common ground. What do we call a transfer of wealth conducted through legislation, documented in meticulous detail on one side and utter silence on the other? The commons were taken. The law said it was legal. The record said it was progress. The rent is still being collected.